In early 1955, the State Council of the People's Republic of China put forward this proposal regarding the simplifying of the written Chinese language. This simplification scheme attracted global attention, even from countries that had no official ties with the People's Republic of China. The theory behind these reforms was that they would simplify the language and the process of learning with hopes of significantly increasing literacy throughout China. And as usual, politics overcame the practical side of the language reform, with critics around the world worried that this was a sign of aggression by the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, I've got to warn you guys, there's going to be a little bit of talk here about communist conspiracies in the rest of this video. But when you look at the history of written Chinese and its reforms, the simplification scheme really doesn't come off as some sort of horrible conspiracy theory designed to, like drive a wedge between the Chinese people and its own heritage or something like that. Actually, there's a lot of historical precedent for demanding uniformity in the written language of China. If you go back to the earliest examples of Chinese characters, you'll find things like these so-called jiahu symbols, which come from around 6000 BC. If you look closely, you can see this character that looks sort of like an eye on this ancient turtle shell. Eventually, those primitive characters developed into the script used on oracle bones, which date back to something like 2000 BC. These characters seem to be generally pictographic and are a bit more stylized than what Chinese characters eventually became, and of course they are also clearly different than those old jiahu symbols. So those are the earliest examples of Chinese writing that we have, and they're really, really old. But as you can see, that early writing looks nothing like modern characters, including the modern traditional characters. In other words, there's been a lot of change over the years. During the Zhou dynasty and up through the end of the Qin dynasty, the so-called seal script was popular. This is an example of the large seal script, otherwise known as dazhuan. And alternatively, here is the small seal script known as xiaozhuan. Now, a lot of these examples come from inscribed stones, which helped preserve a permanent record of the writing style at the time. As you can probably see, these characters are very difficult to read, even if you're fluent in Chinese. You really need to spend time learning them, in particular as if they were separate characters. Now, even though my explanation here only took like a minute or so, we're still talking about a period of like thousands of years. So tons of Chinese characters had been written, and people needed at least some sort of guide to figure out what each character was and what it meant. Now, the infamous Qin Shi Huangdi, or the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, was known for destroying books and for harming scholarship. And so it's kind of ironic that the first serious attempt at creating a Chinese character like dictionary or compilation came under his reign. That would be the so-called Cancang or Cangjiepian, a book that covered a little over 3,300 characters. So the idea behind this book was to standardize the Chinese script, and it had the additional effect of making it possible to study the meaning of all those different Chinese characters. The characters were grouped together according to their meaning and were written in a kind of unusual poetic form. There are fragments on bamboo slips that have been discovered, though the full original text has been lost over the centuries. And that wasn't the end of Chinese character reform and refinement. In fact, the constant tinkering with character styles was one of the hallmarks of Chinese bureaucracy during the imperial era. In the Han Dynasty, Li Shu, or the so-called clerical script, wound up gaining prominence over the various seal script styles. If you're familiar with Chinese characters, these are likely the first characters in the history of the language that actually look legible to you. And this clerical font is still in use today, including on the sign for the Beijing South Railway Station. But the clerical script didn't wind up being the style of Chinese that lasted through the years. There was one more major stylistic reform that created what we know today as traditional Chinese. The major script style is called the Kaishu and is usually referred to as regular script in English. This dates back to the Three Kingdoms period, or around 230 AD. For all intents and purposes, this is the form of Chinese that you will learn in school. It's easy to learn and easy to read, which is why it became so popular over the centuries. But that's not the only script style that was popular at the time. So as you might already know, Chinese calligraphy, or just the writing of Chinese characters, has become an art form in and of itself. And that's where you get to Caoshu, or the so-called cursive writing system. This is the part where Chinese characters become a lot of fun. Unless you've taken the time to carefully study Chinese calligraphy, most of the Caoshu will seem to you like scribbles. There are also significant variants in the style of Caoshu, as you can see from these numerous ways to write the character long, or dragon. As aesthetically pleasing as this writing is, it's also difficult to read. Personally, I have a really hard time making out anything here. And then there are examples of mixes between the regular script and the cursive script, which gives you a potentially infinite combination of character possibilities. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is because there was a major pedagogy or instructing problem with these characters and with their styles. So I just named 5 different major historical variations of Chinese characters, and that doesn't count the minor variants and the most ancient versions. If you're trying to teach children how to read, it's almost an impossible task, and that's not even counting all of the varieties of the spoken language that existed in the country. And we see that problem most prominently on display when we look at the history of written Japanese. The earliest Japanese texts we have date from around 750 AD, and if you look closely, you will see that it's written in Chinese characters. Of course, it's not practical to use only Chinese characters to write out a completely different language like Japanese, and this inevitably led to reforms. So the Japanese wound up modifying Chinese characters to essentially invent their own script. Now, don't start thinking that this is really strange or bizarre or unique. In fact, when we look at the history of writing in the West, we see the same thing. So it turns out that if you're trying to figure out a way to write down the words that you speak, your neighbors speak, and your whole country speaks, the easiest thing to do is to borrow a script from somewhere else and then change that script to suit your needs. So we see it all over the place with Latin-based alphabets, with the Cyrillic script, with Arabic, and so on. In 8th century Japan, there was a book called the Manyoshu, which included poems written in both Chinese characters and with a kind of alphabet referred to as Manyogana. This is the earliest example in Japanese of a writing style designed to represent Japanese sounds as opposed to Chinese characters that represented both sounds and concepts. As time went on, the Manyogana was simplified and stylized, giving rise to modern alphabets such as the katakana. And here's the same process that led to the hiragana alphabet, and notice the clear influence of the Caoshu writing style. So you see, the way that writing and literacy works in history and in the real world is that it winds up being adaptive to the circumstances around it. So sometimes these are political circumstances, and sometimes the changes are made for practical reasons. In other words, the Japanese did not develop hiragana and katakana because they had some major political or ideological difference with China. Instead, they developed these writing styles because of how hard it was to use Chinese characters to represent an entirely different language with completely different grammar. In other words, this isn't some kind of conspiracy. This is actually a practical attempt to make it so that ordinary people have a chance of actually, learning how to read and write. As printing became more common and popular, literacy in China increased rapidly through the Qing dynasty. As more people had the ability to read, there was more demand for good literature, and we saw a greater variety of writing as a result. That's actually one of the reasons Dream of the Red Chamber has been so popular over the years. It was published at a time when literacy was growing rapidly. And notice the presence of the Old Seal script next to this illustration in the 1792 edition, something that was still in use for stylistic reasons in those days. The rise of a literate society gave way to social reform movements that ironically were intended to increase literacy. But it's also tied in with this general notion that China had fallen behind the rest of the world, and that for some reason Chinese characters were to blame for that. The real key to understanding the reform movement is to study Japan's Meiji Restoration, which was a major political development in the late 1860s. Japan had been closed off to contact with the outside world during the Tokugawa shogunate, a period of over 250 years known as Sakoku, or locked country. It was Commodore Matthew Perry and the U.S. Navy that forced Japan into opening up to trade with the United States. This was the beginning of the unequal treaties. The forced opening led to a period of political unrest in Japan that led to the downfall of the shogunate. And the Meiji Emperor took advantage of the political strife to centralize power, giving rise to what has become modern Japan. Now, I know that that's a major oversimplification. Those of you who have history degrees are probably trying to come after me, but you get the general idea. A big part of the Meiji Restoration was the reform of the Japanese language. This created a standard language that they called Hyongjugo, or Standard Japanese. And they also established a national system of public schools. Now, this wound up contributing to the fierce nationalism of Japan during the early 20th century. Sure, after all, the government was controlling education and therefore could control what people learned and how they thought. But it also looked at the time like a model that the rest of Asia should follow. And this was a huge, huge contrast to what life was like in the Qing dynasty in China. Dream of the Red Chamber is great because it gives us insight into just about every aspect of Chinese society, including what schools were like in the early Qing dynasty. Zhao Baoyu and his same-sex romantic interest, Qin Zhong, wind up attending a family school together. This was a school that was set up for education for family members that were not so well off. So in Imperial China, schools like this were established by large families to provide education for the children of family members who might not be able to afford it otherwise. And you have to remember that sometimes these were children of family members that were sort of loosely connected with the family, like, somewhere along the way somebody's aunt married into the family, that sort of thing. And you have to realize that formal education and passing the imperial examinations were the way to advance in society at the time. Anyway, in the book, the classroom scene devolves into utter chaos for reasons that are a bit too complex for this video. But the characters involved don't dare continue fighting after the chaos dies down for fear of losing their access to education. You see, even though Chinese society at the time was more literate than ever before, the social and economic gap between those who were literate and those who were not was huge, and it was only growing larger. And anyway, that's where you get those calls for language reform. If you look at the controversy over language and literature reform in China in the very early 20th century, you will actually see a lot of very, very extreme positions that were a lot more controversial than just simplifying the characters. In fact, because of its emphasis on colloquial language and grammar, Dream of the Red Chamber served as a kind of inspiration for those who wanted to reform Chinese literature. That inspiration built up over the years and exploded in the famous May 4th, 1919 protests against the unequal parts of the Treaty of Versailles. In a very real sense, the May 4th movement is what marked a break between the older literary traditions and more colloquial and modern writing. And of course, it was also closely tied with the birth and early development of the Chinese Communist Party. But it's still not entirely correct to see the eventual simplification of Chinese characters as like some sort of natural outgrowth of a communist agenda. Actually, there was a robust debate behind the scenes about how to modernize or westernize the written language. And surprisingly, there were some people who called for the characters to be replaced entirely by something like pinyin. It was actually Marco Polo who first introduced Latin letters into China through his 1605 publication Shizi Qiji, The Miracle of Western Characters. As you can see, this was an attempt to use Chinese to teach people how Latin letters were pronounced. Over time, the popularity of the Chinese classics among readers of Western literature gave rise to early attempts to Romanize the Chinese language. And so you had early attempts at romanization through the likes of James Legge, who famously translated the Chinese classics into English in the 1850s and 1860s. So if you've read the old James Legge books, you know that his romanization wasn't exactly great, but his emphasis on romanizing the characters was certainly in tune with the spirit of the times. There was constant political pressure within China itself for language reforms during the late years of the Qing dynasty. This culminated eventually with the creation of a romanization system by Thomas Wade in 1859. Wade was the first professor of Chinese at Cambridge and created a popular romanization system as part of an early Chinese textbook in the 1860s. This was later expanded on and revised by Herbert Giles. He was a former British diplomat who also happened to serve as a professor of Chinese at Cambridge. It was this 1892 Chinese-English dictionary that popularized the so-called Wade-Giles system. This is a system of romanization that remains in use among academics in certain fields to this day. But honestly, Wade-Giles is not a great system, even if you're used to using it. Now, the problem is that it's not particularly good at clearly expressing the differences between certain sounds. You feel like everything begins with like a CH or a TS, something like that. And that's why pinyin was eventually developed in mainland China. The development of pinyin is most closely associated with Zhou Youguang, a Chinese linguist who focused his work on helping increase the literacy of the population. Now, in my opinion, the system that Zhou and his colleagues developed is absolutely brilliant, and it seems uniquely well fit to the idiosyncrasies of the standard Chinese language. These days, you really can't expect to learn Chinese as a foreigner without learning pinyin first. While some older systems, such as Juyin Fuhao or Bopomofo, remain popular in places like Taiwan, pinyin is simply easier to use, easier to adapt to, and doesn't require learning a completely different alphabet. But the rise of pinyin itself was controversial. The reason why is because it was so closely tied with the Chinese Communist Party. Every single step along the way, the fact that the Communist Party was associated with these developments meant that people were very, very skeptical. Now, there were whispers for a while about potentially replacing all Chinese characters with nothing but pinyin, though fortunately that kind of talk didn't last for long. The problem, of course, is that Chinese characters themselves have a certain meaning, and homophones are ridiculously common, especially in the literary form of the language. So, as you probably already know, the French colonial rulers of Vietnam started educating the populace in Chữ Quốc ngữ, or the Romanized version of Vietnamese, a few years before the start of World War I. Now, traditionally, Vietnamese had been written in so-called Chữ Nôm, a system of modified Chinese characters designed to write colloquial Vietnamese words. Even if you're well-versed in classical Chinese, however, you will struggle with Chữ Nôm since it includes characters that are unique to Vietnam. And then you get complicated works like this, which shows a literary Chinese text along with characters intended to assist with phonetic pronunciation in Vietnamese. And so even though Chữ Quốc ngữ has some odd rules and isn't really all that easy for foreigners to learn, it does seem to be an improvement from the older way of doing things. But of course, Vietnam wasn't exactly doing well economically and definitely not politically when these reforms hit China. It was still a colony of France. And there was a problem with distinguishing between words with similar or identical pronunciation, something that is a problem, of course, in Vietnamese and is also a problem in Korean and in Japanese when there are no Chinese characters present. And that's one of the major reasons why those in charge in China chose to keep the characters around. In November 1946, right after the end of World War II, the Japanese Ministry of Education published a list of 1,850 Toyo kanji, or general use Chinese characters. Like so many reforms in the past, this appears to have been an attempt at standardizing characters and wound up simplifying a lot of the more complex characters. This eventually gave way to the Shinjitai reform of the late 1940s, which involved even more character simplification. And if you look closely at some of these, you will recognize some simplifications that look a lot like what we see in Simplified Chinese. So the report is that the Japanese government originally wanted to ban the use of kanji, or the Chinese characters, altogether during World War II, but again, fortunately that never happened. Again, the problem is that Chinese characters are really, really useful when it comes to the nuanced meanings that you see in actual literature. Anyway, the Chinese Communist Party built its Simplified Chinese reforms in part on the Shinjitai simplifications and in part on some other rules that they came up with. But there was still quite a bit of controversy. First of all, you've got to realize that the simplification scheme itself was a process. The middle columns here are early drafts from China's 1955 proposal to simplify characters and includes a lot of characters that you've probably never seen. The final one is a further simplification done in part to make the characters easier to write and in some cases to make things a lot more clear. And then there's always the human element in processes like this, and the human element tends to make some really bizarre decisions. So some of the simplification is obvious, such as this for shu, or book. A word like dui, or correct, is easier to read when it's reduced to its more basic structure, like you can see here. Sometimes there was a classical precedent for a change, such as e or different. The simplified version also shows up in old texts. And some changes come from the Shinjitai in Japan. For example, this change to shui, or to learn. And sometimes there were decisions that don't really make much sense or are really confusing. For example, the part on the right in Han, or Chinese, turns into the character yo when it's simplified. However, something completely different happens with tan, to sigh. And in Huan, to be happy, a different design turns into that yo character. Anyway, I could go on. There are a lot of inconsistencies that come up with simplified characters, and while they are theoretically easier to read, the truth is that things can be really confusing. For example, the character wu has a simplification that makes sense and has a classical precedent, sure. However, the simplified version looks a lot like tian, or heaven, and can be really hard to distinguish if you're not an experienced reader. Du, to read, becomes a lot more simple in its simplified form. But the traditional form of du, to show disrespect, is a little bit easier to distinguish in traditional Chinese than the two characters are in the simplified characters. The traditional character for gan, which means dry, is simplified greatly, but that simplified character is very difficult to distinguish between chen or 1,000. So it's not necessarily simpler to use simplified Chinese. Now, you should know that this is rarely an issue when you're actually reading a text. It's almost always going to be obvious from the text and the context what the character actually should be, how it should be read, what it means, and so on and so forth. But it's also not entirely clear that simplified characters have actually increased literacy, which is what they were intended to do in the first place. Now, there is an argument to be made that either simplified characters or the introduction of pinyin helped with literacy in mainland China, as shown in this extremely simple graphic that I found on Reddit. The truth, though, is that simplified characters didn't automatically lead to literacy. Rather, a government emphasis on education is what led to literacy. And it wasn't because of pinyin itself, because as you can see in this propaganda photo, for a while they were using bopomofo to teach Chinese in 1952 at least. The truth is that a certain level of literacy was useful to the Communist Party for the spread of propaganda, which is obvious if you can read what this lady is reading in this photo. And anyway, it turns out that you will almost certainly wind up with a literate population if the state has, a really good reason to want a literate population. But that brings us up to the most interesting point of all, which is the one that always comes up in this discussion. I mean, isn't Simplified Chinese just one really big communist conspiracy designed to detach the Chinese people from its heritage? Now, if you spend your time reading literature from the late 1960s and early 1970s, you will be convinced that simplified characters naturally mean propaganda. Though you can actually see a few traditional characters, at least on this page. This comes from the January 1968 edition of the Communist Party's official magazine Hongqi, or Red Flag. And of course, if you look around, you can still find old traditional Chinese versions of things like the collected works of Chairman Mao in used bookstores in China. But of course, the most famous party publication of all, the quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, or the Little Red Book, was printed using only simplified Chinese. And of course, it's pretty obvious that you're going to wind up with a very literate country if you force people to memorize and quote random things that the leader has said before they're allowed to buy food in a store. And that actually was a practice during the Cultural Revolution. I'm not making that up. But the issue here is that the simplification process of the written language is not really the thing that caused literacy. Now, it was almost certainly all these mass political movements. You see, Taiwan and Hong Kong have managed to also create a literate population despite using traditional characters. So it turns out that the number of strokes each character has really doesn't have anything to do with literacy rates. Or, as some random person on Reddit wisely said about a decade ago, the simplified script doesn't mean that there are fewer characters to learn. But at the same time, the simplified script also does not mean that the text is government propaganda, or that there was some crazy change made to the text, or that the poster online is part of whatever it is, like getting the Wu Mao for every post, or any of that other nonsense. I mean, it's not the 1960s anymore, and people really need to remember that. So when it comes to something like Dream of the Red Chamber, it's pretty obvious that I prefer to read it in traditional characters. Actually, my preference is to read the original 1792 edition, which of course is written in the old regular style. But the truth is that my preference for traditional characters does not invalidate versions in simplified Chinese at all. Actually, some of the best critical works on the book are only available in simplified characters. So if you're going to read something at this level, you really ought to read both. And you should, by this time, if you're reading Hong Lo Meng, you probably should know already both simplified and traditional Chinese. But of course, the million-dollar question is which one of the two you should learn first. Now, most Chinese language programs will likely only teach you simplified characters. But if you have a choice, I would strongly recommend learning traditional first, and here's why. While traditional characters have more strokes, the truth is that it's easier to learn simplified after learning traditional than the other way around. In some cases, the complex abstractions in the traditional characters are really hard to memorize if you're used to the simplified form. Of course, if you're really serious about the Chinese language, chances are good that you will wind up learning both eventually. But it's going to require a lot less time down the road if you decide to learn traditional characters first and then move to simplified once you've got some experience. And above all, if you want to learn to read in Chinese, you really have to practice writing. And that means writing both traditional and simplified Chinese, believe it or not. Look, if native speakers of this language learn how to read through writing, then the same should count for you. Now, the other thing I want to say is that if you're going to learn how to read, find something that you enjoy. Don't just read the textbook. The textbook is boring. Find something that you like, read a comic book, read whatever, and start with that so that you have an incentive to read, because textbooks are going to put you to sleep. Anyway, there you have it. Simplified Chinese is not a conspiracy. But personally, I still prefer traditional.